Have I mentioned that Mao is a complicated figure to study? I think I mentioned that several times. Today's historians, like, post 2010, tend to look at Mao in this like sitting on the fence kind of way. They're like, well, he did some good and he did some bad. Maybe the bad's over exaggerated, maybe not. And so he's a difficult person to study, and I'm going to continue to say that there's multiple perspectives on him. You ask a conservative historian, they will probably trash him till the day is done. Regardless, it's important to understand his ideology. It was shaped by the fact that he was a peasant. He came from a peasant background, but he was educated. So rather than going into farming, he was sent to study. And that's going to influence him as well. He's going to attend the first meeting of the CCP in 1921. But at first, he wasn't their leader. I mean, most of the leaders really argued that this was an urban thing that had to happen, that we had to mobilize. I wasn't there, but anyways, that they had to mobilize the workers. Whereas Mao was like, wait a minute, China's like 99.9% peasants. Let's involve them. Plus, you have to understand that China had a long history of peasants being involved. This idea of the mandate of heaven, which it pre-existed. Most of the dynasties that ruled China, was the idea that if your government wasn't doing well, you lost the mandate of heaven. And honestly, studying Mao, looking at his policies, he does not appear any different than maybe perhaps a progressive emperor of the Qing dynasty or the Yuan dynasty for that matter, or the Song dynasty or the Zhao dynasty. I mean, going back to definitely the Chen dynasty. He loved that comparison, by the way, of himself with that first emperor of China. So, Mao is really no different. I would argue that the government in China exists much like it's existed for 2,000 years. What's important to know about his ideology, it became defined over time. It usually coincided with some, attack by the nationalist or by Chiang Kai-shek. And so it becomes more refined and, main tenements are added, but there's an emphasis on peasants, first of all. That's the most important part. Also, a two-stage revolution, the idea that we're going to do this in stages. First we'll involve the middle class or the bourgeoisie, and then we'll eliminate them. And frankly, he does. There's also mass mobilization of the people. Everybody's involved. Volunteerism, and nobody's above a job. Everybody does something. Continuous revolution. This revolution is never over. It's continuing. We have to root out all, blah, 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 blah. And also self-criticism and rectification. It's just a Buddhist tendency, by the way. Ruthless determination, which he showed, and a demand that his own ideology be followed and be the guiding force. This is going to lead to a split with the Soviets later on. So once Mao came to power in 1949, his ideology was set and put into action. There'll be other times as he gets older where he does some like radical things, as we'll see, but pretty much the same tenets are going to stand throughout this time period. So, Maoist ideology, or what we're just going to term Maoism, developed over time. Mao was an incredibly educated young man. He was from a middle-ranking peasant family, so he understood the hardship. He, understood the humiliation brought about by foreign influence and everything like that. And, he also was educated. He went to school. He studied Marxism there. He studied Western philosophers like Adam Smith. He studied Charles Darwin. He was convinced that the only cure for China, it would have to be a military one. It would have to be a revolution. And he's convinced by 1918. Throughout the 20s, he's still working on his ideology. It's not going to change too much, but it's not going to be until the Long March of 1934 where Mao's ideology was clear. His adaptation of Marxism for peasants was what won him support in the region, especially during the Yin and Soviet. He encouraged volunteerism and mass mobilization and self-criticism. Volunteerism kind of refers to an individual's willingness to accept change, to have the shared belief system and live within the community, whereas mass mobilization refers everyone working together to make the state the best, to decide on and carry out policies. Honestly, mass mobilization is never going to happen. I mean, because you also had ruthless determination added to this ideology. This one's going to be long, but it's the key to understanding Maoism. So his first idea was just simply Marxist revolution. Progress would come through a class struggle in which the landowners and the bourgeoisie had to be overthrown. This would then lead to a dictatorship of the proletariat or the masses. There should be collective ownership of the means of production, and socialist states should promote worldwide communist revolution. So that is Marxist revolution in Russia. That is where it's going to be in China. Now, the specific Chinese elements, though, were different. First, the importance of the peasantry. The peasant masses could overthrow capitalism and create a socialist society. And if you know anything about Chinese history, the peasant masses had overthrown a lot of different dynasties. I mean, that's an easy Google search right there. Okay. He also believed in a two-stage revolution. Okay, and then this is it. The first revolution could incorporate elements of the bourgeoisie. You needed them. During this stage, private ownership could continue. A second revolution would bring about the collectivization and the nationalization of property and economic resources and remove the remaining elements of the bourgeoisie. He also believed in mass mobilization and volunteerism, which I talked about on the last slide, but he just basically thought the party should learn from the people. He believed in continuous revolution. Revolution should not cease once a party achieved power, but should be a constant process of renewal to avoid complacency and corruption. He also thought of self-criticism. Officials should undergo a regular criticism to prevent them from becoming self-satisfied and elitist, and regular purges of the party would keep it pure. Only through self-criticism would individuals see the wisdom of mass campaigns and rectify false thoughts. He also had ruthless determination. He believed that willpower and determination would be sufficient to bring about change, provided everyone showed total commitment. Violence was a necessary element of revolution. Mao Zedong was always right, and people could find the solution to any problem if they studied his thoughts sufficiently. And that was, one of the key elements as well, is the primacy of Mao Zedong's thought. He won't compile his little red book until the 1960s, but all of this is really kind of settled by the Long March. I would argue that his ideology did help him consolidate power in 1949. And he certainly held it until his death in 1976, with a short period between, in the early 60s where he disappears for a time. So it did help him. I would argue that most of his policies were kind of failed. And although China is a powerhouse today, I would probably argue that's more for men we're about to meet than Mao. His policies like the Great Leap Forward caused the Great Chinese Famine, probably the worst famine in all of world history. So, that's problematic. And then he institutes the Cultural Revolution where he just attacks everybody. There's also a social education movement where he just uses it as a way to get intellectuals to show themselves and then kills them. There's purge after purge. I mean, it says a lot about some of these men that they survive in order to really rescue China in the 1980s. Now, that's my argument. One could also argue that Mao was successful, that it was because Mao was able to get peasants to do more than farm, that they were able to industrialize. And, also his belief in himself and his own leadership, tended to be the most damaging aspect of his ideology. I will argue 100% that a bad leader is somebody who cannot admit when they're wrong. If you can't admit when you're wrong, then you can't change course. It's like, in my opinion, just one of the worst things for leadership. So anyways, when he's not successful too, he just blames the bourgeoisie. That was part of the Cultural Revolution, was just killing off anybody that didn't agree with him. By 1962, he actually steps down and you get a new president of China. He hasn't disappeared necessarily, but he has stepped down and things are beginning to change. But in 1966, he just returns again. He's just far more oppressive and older. Don't make me make the argument that old people shouldn't rule. I'm not going to make that argument. Of course, I'm not making that argument. No. So it seems during this period that Mao really lost his mind. I mean, he is in his 70s, and yes, that is a photograph of Mao swimming in a river in his 70s. He is proving in 1966 that he was still strong enough to swim in a very strong river. And it was a well-organized propaganda movement to announce he was coming back. And so he comes back to power. You know, he stepped down from 59 to 66. He was still doing stuff like the socialist education movement, but the others in charge were trying to lessen that effect. And that whole movement in 1962 was just designed to put party ideology into education. He also used it as a way to get intellectuals to come out of hiding so that he could then kill them, but that is beside the point, right? By 1966, though, he's full on cultural revolution. Chinese historians call this the 10 decades of hell. I'm kidding. I don't know what they call it, but something like that. This is like that. I said 10 decades, 10 years. 10 years of not a good time if we're really looking at the true translation of it. But anyways, this starts in 1966. Historians have so many arguments as to why he started this. This was just while it says cultural revolution, it is so misnamed. It's mostly, like kill anybody with imposing culture. And that's what's going to happen. You're going to have complete censorship at this time. His fourth wife, by the way, just better known as Madame Mao, is in charge kind of now. I mean, she's one of the reasons historians blame his, period. They blame her. It's called the blame the woman defense. But anyways, so he is in power. He does have a tight group of people around him, and this is the period where he's going to kill all his friends. It seems every authoritarian dictator does this at some point, or maybe all his friends are like turn against him. I don't know why, but it just seems like the last phase of every authoritarian leader is to turn on ultimately the people closest. And during this period, a lot of the men that survived the Long March will not survive Mao. He's going to die in 1976 without really leaving a clear successor. What does happen is Madame Mao and some of her friends try to take over the government, and they fail and they're imprisoned. Madame Mao will hang herself in 1991. So, happy ending, right? I'm just kidding. That's a terrible joke. Terrible, terrible. If I was making the argument that ultimately Mao failed, and it was really these two men actually that were more responsible for the CCP surviving, Mao's death. Look at Spain, for instance. Okay, so Franco's going to rule all the way to his death. I'm going to say it's like 1965. I don't know. It's like 74, 75, somewhere around there, okay? And he survives, and as soon as he dies, he thinks he's leaving the king of Spain from that old inbred family, the Bourbon dynasty, in charge. I hate to say that, but oh my gosh, please. Okay, so he leaves him in charge thinking he's going to continue the fascist government of Franco. He actually leaves him as his heir. And as soon as Franco dies, the king, who's Juan Carlos II, was like, nope, changing everything. So, the fact that the CCP survives after Mao's death is really accredited to these two men. I'm going to butcher their names, of course, but we have Liu Shaoqi and Diang Xiaoping. Especially Diang Xiaoping. Look, Liu, I'm just going to call him by the first names. We're good friends, right? Liu's not going to survive Mao. He's going to die in prison in 1969 from quote unquote complications from diabetes. But Diang does survive. He survives and goes on. He serves as president in the early 60s, but he's going to be president again in the 80s when China opens up their economy. So, first let's talk about Liu, though. He joined the CCP very early on. He was a contemporary of Mao, so he joins in 1921 as well. He had trained in the Soviet Union as a communist organizer and theorist in the 1920s. He was a close ally of Mao during the early years, during even the Long March, and he succeeded Mao as chairman of the Republic in 1959 when Mao steps down. But he was denounced during the Cultural Revolution in 1966 for taking the capitalist road and opposing the communes, and he was expelled from the CCP in 1968, and then he's just going to die in prison. It's quite sad. Dieng, on the other hand, he was the son of a peasant, and he joined the Communist Party while in a work-study program in France in the 1920s. He also studied communism in Moscow and was one of the members of the Long March. He was a military leader during the Civil War, and after 1949, he became an important figure in economic restructuring. He was oftentimes the man that was like, "Hey, Mao, chill, calm down." He was that rational voice in Mao's head. And unfortunately, he didn't always want to hear it. He became the general secretary of the party's Central Committee in 1956, but was denounced at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. One could also argue that there was a new player in politics, and that was Madame Mao, but I'll make that argument later. He was purged twice, but was a paramount leader of the People's Republic of China from 1978 to 1992. And again, I would argue that he was far more responsible for shaping modern China than Mao was. I mean, and he survived Mao, so kudos to him. So Mao's going to step down in 1959 as head of the party. He's going to retreat from public life for a time. I mean, he's still influential. He's going to institute, for instance, the socialist education movement of 1962. Again, this was a way to purge people. And then he disappears for a time, but he reemerges in July of 1966 by famously and probably staged. He takes a swim in the river. And it makes headlines everywhere and it's a big deal. And they're like, oh, look at the 70-year-old, he can swim. We'll see it again as we're watching 70-year-olds vie for power. And I don't mean to, I mean, this might be watched by future generations where this issue is already decided. But I'm just saying he's kind of trying to prove that he's strong enough to lead China. And then in 1966, he, claims that, China's lapsing back into its old ways of bureaucratic hell and whatnot. And he worried that a new communist elite was rising up. He believed in continuous revolution. So he announces that he's going to have a revolution. It's a cultural revolution. This is a period we often see it with dictators where, first they turn against like the enemy, then they start getting lower people. And the last stage of a dictatorship always seems to be like, kill my friends. Let me get the people that were on the long march with me. Let me kill them. Let me kill my best friends. It's so weird. And that's what Mao did during the Cultural Revolution. Some argue, and I guess apologists argue, they like that blame the woman theory. There's always a blame the woman theory. So let's blame Madame Mao, and she'll certainly get in a lot of trouble after he dies. And she actually hangs herself in like 1991. So not a great outcome for Madame Mao. But there's that argument too that it was her fault. Anyways, he comes back to power in 1966. And this is a bad period. I mean, this is a period where you're going to see constant propaganda, constant fear, use of camps. If you diverged any way, you could be sent to these re-education camps, still being used, I guess they say, still to this day, especially in places like North Korea. So the Cultural Revolution, was essentially a paradox. It was impossible to reconcile volunteerism, whereby men and women were re-educated to participate willingly in the mass struggle, with Mao's determination to stamp out the bourgeoisie thinking. Mao was forced to resort to extensive repression, brainwashing, and a lot of violence. Early revolutionaries became the regime's victims, and in an attempt to prove their socialist credentials, other people began to turn on each other. It got really scary. I mean, Mao, in his own words, said that the cleansing process would lead to great disorder across the land, leading to great order. And that's exactly what happened. You get young groups that create communes, they just begin killing each other. It is just, we don't even know the extent to how many people died. And, conservative historians put it at 2 million. And who's to say? China's certainly not releasing this information to anybody. So as he gets closer to his death, the persecutors just become more radical and more people are dying. And it looks like, the Gang of Four who are leading Mao during the later years of his life, it looks like they're going to rule China too. But You know, well, okay. So Lao is going to die in prison, so he's done. But Dieng is still alive, and it's, in my opinion, that he comes in at the last moment and, saves it. So this is going to be kind of a long rant, but in the end, Mao was a really disappointing historical figure for me personally. I find anybody at the extreme to be disappointing, but in this case, you look at the results of modern China, you see how far they've spread. It's scary and dangerous to the American political ideology, but still yet impressive. And you want to wonder if that was Mao. But in the end, I don't think it was Mao. I think that China succeeded despite Mao and not because of him. And that was unfortunate. I think, in terms of how he's complicated to study, I'm not sure he's so complicated anymore. He seems to have followed the same route as many a totalitarian megalomaniac. They come to power doing good. I mean, if you just study Mao in the Chinese Civil War, you do not look after 1949, you might find him to be heroic and wonderful. I did. But once you start getting into the 1950s, and then certainly from 1966 to 1976, you can't argue that his policies were destructive, they were mean. He's killing mass amounts of people, and in the end, he ended up becoming exactly what he fought against, a warlord and, and an emperor. He ruled no differently than the emperors of old, who could have your head cut off if you looked at him in the eye. He could have anybody murdered at any moment. I'm having a hard time seeing how his rule and what he did from at least 1959 to 1976 was any different than any emperor that existed before him. I think China might be just predestined to be ruled by, autocracy. That's my long-winded conclusion. I'm sorry it's so long. And, honestly, Mao's ideology, beliefs brought turmoil and destruction to his people. I think it's fair to say that social and economic improvements occurred, despite him rather than because of him. His strong ideological principles were problematic. His view that unless the Communist Party was regularly purified, it would cease to be a revolutionary force became ultimately dangerous for his friends. He also thought that China would cease to be socialist if they didn't purge themselves every once in a while. This is just autocratic behavior and in no way benefited China.